All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Jason Kuhn. I'm the executive director of the Bandar Center. So the Bandar Center for Medical Business Ethics was established in 2007 with a goal to promote ethical business practices in medicine and healthcare. Through research, education, community engagement, we hope to better understand and better communicate the ethical relationships between healthcare professionals, patients, businesses, and society. Ethics is a remarkable human endeavor. We believe that a better future can be created by engaging one another's unique professional and personal stories. We encourage open dialogue on the issue of medical business ethics by bringing people together in inspiring spaces for thoughtful reflection. Our challenge, therefore, is to hear from voices from across the community, to take part in and to encourage each other on this important journey. To that extent, the Bandar Center has no physical location, but we find ourselves all over St. Louis, inhabiting, if only for a few moments, a space like this one, CAM STL. We're a little bit nomadic, but in the truest sense. My highest hope is that someone here today will get a spark from something that was said or meet someone compelling to collaborate with, start a project, network, invest in something worthwhile, start a company, change the world for the better. So I'm thrilled that my guest today is Zubin Austin. Zubin is a professor and Kohlfler Chair in Management at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy and the Institute for Health Policy, Management, and Evaluation, the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on professional and personal development of the healthcare workforce. He's published over 200 manuscripts and authored 4 reference texts. In 2017, in recognition of the societal significance of his research, he was installed as a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, one of the highest honors for health services researchers in Canada. He is the only University of Toronto professor ever to have received both the President's Teaching Award for Sustained Excellence in Education and the President's Research Impact Award for the importance of his research in Canada and internationally. He has also been named the Professor of the Year by students on 20 separate occasions. Our discussant this evening is Katherine Mathews. Katherine is an obstetrician gynecologist with a background in medical education, public health, and healthcare administration. She's dedicated her career to improving the delivery of high-quality healthcare with a focus on low-income and minority populations and on preparing the next generation of healthcare professionals. Dr. Mathews is an associate professor at SLU and is the director of education for the Bandar Center. And so, with no further ado, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Zubin, for being here.
My pleasure.
So we're here to talk about competency. Can you tell us, as a healthcare professional, what this concept is and why it matters for us to think about it and talk about it?
Actually, I can't.
Okay, there we go. Okay, we're done.
And I think that's part of the problem. One of the issues that if you actually are a practitioner, it's a really hard thing to be able to define competency. We have subjective or emotional ideas about what competency is. We recognize as people who age and develop across a life course that competency changes, that what passed for competency when I was a 22-year-old isn't what passes for competency when you are in your late 50s. This sort of sliding scale, moving target, changing trajectory that defines competency is a real issue. And yet when we look at the competency literature, when we look at assessment of competency, when we talk about maintenance of competency, that reality of the human development associated with the person being asked to demonstrate competency rarely comes up.
So what aspects of being human as professionals, we come at this as humans, gets missed by this concept of competency?
I'm so happy you asked that question. As anybody who has ever been asked to jump through a hoop to prove that they are competent will tell you, one of the challenges associated with our current, and I would use the term slavish adherence to competency as an organizing framework for education, regulation, and employment, is that it simply doesn't take into account important concepts like wisdom, compassion, concern, judgment. especially in a health context, but certainly not exclusively to a health context. This is what professionals do. This is who professionals are. This is why society needs professionals in the first place, to be wise, to be compassionate, to actually fire on all pistons. It's really interesting. When I was a student, just more than 35 years ago, you would never use the word competency to describe a person. You'd say a bladder is competent. And somewhere along the ways, we suddenly believe that it's okay to describe people as competent. It's a fairly low bar. Like if I needed an obstetrician gynecologist, I think I'd want somebody who was more than competent. Competent does not seem a particularly aspirational goal, and certainly if you are a recipient of professional services, I would want something far more than just competent. Yet we're seemingly quite satisfied when students demonstrate competence, when professionals prove that they have maintained their competence. There seems to be a disconnect between what we actually want when we become patients and what educators and regulators expect of us.
You mentioned both education and regulation. For folks who maybe don't understand that side of professional practice, can you talk a little bit about your role with regulation and what that looks like?
Yep. I have a relatively unique niche in research, that most of my research actually focuses in on the regulatory community. I do a lot of work with medical educators and health professions educators, and certainly education is an important part of professional development. But those who govern our practice as professionals, those who establish the hoops through which we're expected to jump through, the regulators, have until relatively recently not been themselves very often the subject or the object of research. And I think that's a really critical issue to raise, because all of us, regardless of your profession, even if you are not a professional, we operate in an environment that is absolutely shaped by regulation and regulatory philosophy, whether we know it or not, or recognize it or not. Regulators are perfectly fine and lovely people, don't get me wrong.
I'm one.
As I said, a perfectly fine and lovely person. But as can frequently happen, sometimes perfectly lovely and fine people, they get a little bit caught up in the work that they do and don't necessarily question the foundational assumptions of their field. We sometimes refer to this as they sometimes drink the Kool-Aid of their field and think what we do is so important. What we do is the only way to do this. This is the only way of seeing certain things. The philosopher Kenneth Burke once said, every way of seeing something is also a way of not seeing other things. As we have focused very strongly on regulation and competence as our ways of ensuring safe and effective practice of professions, what are we missing? The amount of time, money, energy, effort that we expend on competency as a way of defining safe and effective practice of a profession, what other things could we be doing with that? These are the kinds of questions that can be uncomfortable for regulators to hear, but I think are absolutely crucial.
I bring up the question of regulation because I, in recent years, have been involved in what's called regulatory medicine, and this was not a term that I understood before. Mm-hmm. But within the United States, for physicians, each state and I believe our territories have a board, a body, that basically regulates who gets a license to practice. Mm-hmm. And if there are complaints or concerns about a practitioner, those boards or bodies discipline that person. What's interesting here in the United States, and I don't know what it's like in Canada, is that there is huge variability across these different bodies across the country. We have a federation of state medical boards, which I think also represents that this is a locally controlled activity. And so here in Missouri, we count on prior assessments of competency when we're looking at someone applying for a license. And so this is this whole space that you and I realized we have some overlap in.
It's actually quite interesting to me. I had the opportunity to deliver a keynote to the Federation of State Medical Boards last year. And if you look across at least the English-speaking world, so countries like Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, It's quite interesting to see how regulatory philosophy is similar and it's different. The United States is a little bit set apart, I'd say, from the rest of the English-speaking world, in part because your healthcare system is so substantially different than it is in these other countries. But especially in the UK and sort of daughter Commonwealth countries like Canada and Australia, the dominant philosophy of regulation has been focused on the notion of self-regulation that is counterbalanced with public engagement. So our regulatory bodies typically will have 51% professional members, 49% lay members, and a government that sits waiting in the wings for moments where those 51% of professional members appear to circle the wagons. It's by no means a perfect system, but that notion that professionals are governing professionals has, I think, insulated some of the non-American jurisdictions from some of perhaps the worst of the legalistic professionalism that dominates decision-making and discussion in the U.S.
And just for folks to know, here in Missouri, we have a board of 9 members. We have a full membership, which is great. We have one so-called public member, and the rest of us are
professional
physicians.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it becomes quite a challenge then to sort of figure out how do you safeguard the public, ensure safe and effective practice of a profession without over-regulating, without stifling creativity, but equally without creating conditions where the public looks and goes, well, they're never going to listen to me anyway because they're all the same profession and they're just going to circle the wagons and protect themselves. That to and fro and that sort of balancing act, every country and every jurisdiction is trying to figure out how to do that. And I think it's actually in that environment that competence, probably about 15 or 20 years ago, really emerged quite rapidly as an answer to how can we juggle all these balls and balance all of these interests.
So here, and this is a part of our environment that I'm not as familiar with, but if we as board members are worried about whether someone really should be practicing, whether they have those basic technical skills, we have ways in the U.S. to send someone to go get assessed for their competency. So again, there's very much that piece of the focus.
Yep.
We do have other times when we might be concerned about their ethical decision making, and I want to talk more about ethics, or issues around inappropriate boundaries, and there are courses or studies, ways people can address that. And I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on all of that.
Yep. I don't mean to completely trash competency. Competency is a perfectly fine and good thing, and nobody can argue against the idea that every practitioner should be competent. My main objection, I think, is that competency has become such an overwhelmingly dominant way we have of discussing things. We seem to believe that as long as we ensure competency, everything is going to be fine. Where this has actually really fallen apart over the last decade is in a very well-publicized case of a hospital in the middle part of England called the Mid Staffordshire Hospital. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the Mid Staffordshire Hospital. It's a very famous case of and it's, in England they have a National Health Service, and so this is a National Health Service hospital. And over the course of about 4 to 7 years, many people unnecessarily died in this hospital. And understandably, governments and the public were extraordinarily concerned about this. Lord Francis was commissioned to undertake an inquiry to understand how could this happen. One of the really interesting findings from this study was this hospital, which was in the middle part of England, perhaps the St. Louis of the United Kingdom. It was a perfectly typical hospital. Virtually every practitioner in that hospital was competent. And yet, when a bunch of competent practitioners working together in a perfectly typical hospital in the middle of England did their perfectly competent work, people died unnecessarily. This really, within the National Health Service and other similar health systems, really provoked a lot of angst because, well, we've been measuring competence. People have been proving they're competent. They're jumping through every hoop we ask them to do. We're not sending people off for like a lot of remedial courses of this hospital. Each individual practitioner was competent, yet somewhere the system that binds them together wasn't working. And this really started to have people recognize that one of the real downsides of competence as an organizing principle for education, for employment, or for regulation is that it starts to produce psychological conditions in which people shrug and go, tell me what you want me to do. I'll do whatever you want me to do, but I'm not going to do anything more than you tell me what to do. Because what if what I do you don't think is competent? In an environment that becomes legalistic, algorithm-driven, that starts to either de-emphasize or actually devalue wisdom, compassion, care, and judgment. Where competence becomes the measurement and the anchor by which people are judged, it understandably starts to produce a response of, tell me what you want me to do. I'm here from 9 to 5. 5 o'clock I go home, it's someone else's job. I can be perfectly competent in that kind of an environment. And I would never want to be a patient in that kind of an environment.
So how do you imagine getting from this place of focus on competency to places where we foster, develop, promote, and assess concepts like wisdom and compassion?
Yep. I think this is an area that is a real hot spot right now, particularly in the United Kingdom. They have pioneered a model of regulation that they call a right touch regulatory philosophy. All of us that are involved in competency-based education know that medical education in particular over the last decade or so has become dominated by checklists, being dominated by this notion that, okay, if you do this, bing, you get to pass go, collect $200, etc. As human beings, though, it's intuitive to us that simply because once or twice or because somebody was watching, you actually were able to get a checklist item complete. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do that when no one else is watching. The right touch regulatory philosophy starts with the understanding that where we have highly legalistic documentation of competency, as we do in medical education, as we do in regulation, we start to create an environment and a culture, and we actually generate a psychological shift in people's thinking to this highly reduced, tell me what you want me to do, and I'm not going to do anything more than that. Instead, if we look to what our colleagues in the private sector, well, not that healthcare isn't private in the United States, but in other private sector industries do, there's a recognition that the most important resource we have in healthcare is the human resource. The problem with competency is that it's antagonistic from the beginning. You're my teacher, I'm your student, I am jumping through hoops to please you. But once I've jumped through those hoops, I don't know how to do anything different. I haven't actually been socialized or encultured into this notion that a professional's job is so much more than jumping through hoops. Competency is necessary, but it is not sufficient for public safeguarding and to ensure the best that we can get out of our healthcare workforce. If I were a patient, I don't want a competent practitioner. I want a practitioner who's firing on all pistons, who is bringing the best of themselves to their job, who is being as creative, as open, as concerned, as caring, just every single thing they have. That's the person I want to trust. Competency appears to interfere with both the socialization and the psychological development of practitioners by reducing the complexity of interpersonal care to checklists.
One of the things that you and I spoke about before this evening, and I'm wanting to pull this in at this time, is this dilemma for people being trained. It's not just the issue of the checklist, but if they meet you or they meet me and they say, how did you get to where you are now? I might tell a story that sounds as though I had some roadmap that I could follow. And in fact, for me, much of the time, this progress through career and career choices was much more like a maze, where I had times of uncertainty, times where I felt like I had made a wrong turn, hit a dead end. And So one of the things that I've been pondering in medical education and in our work around medical business ethics is really fostering more of that awareness of there's not always a checklist, there's not always a right answer, there's not always a clear path. And I wondered if you had any stories that could illustrate in your life how some of that played out for you.
Absolutely. One of the charming things when we had our initial conversation was to realize that what a kindred spirit you were in terms of taking a rather circuitous route to getting to sit in this chair. And for the younger people out there, I totally recognize it's a very different time than it was when I was coming up through the system. The stakes seem so much higher. Everything is so much more expensive. There's a perception that you don't necessarily have the luxury of finding dead ends and saying, well, I tried this for a while, it didn't work, but that's not a catastrophe. My initial professional degree was as a pharmacist, and after I graduated as a pharmacist, I got a wonderful clinical job working at a big Toronto teaching hospital. And it was a wonderful job for about 3 years. And after 3 years, it was like, okay, what comes next? And when you are working as a pharmacist in a hospital, what typically comes next is an administrative route. And so I started doing things like running pharmacy and therapeutics committees and being involved with like drug purchasing decisions. And it was mildly interesting, but that lasted about 1 year. Then after that, my employer actually sent me off to get a Master's of Business Administration degree to sort of help support my development in hospital administration. That was a catastrophic mistake of my employer, because what it introduced me to was the idea that, yeah, like I'm interested in this and it's all fine and good, but I was really captivated by a particular stream of courses I took during my MBA in the area of organizational psychology and behavior. So much of what I saw as a young pharmacist working in a complex teaching hospital environment simply didn't make sense to me. But theories of organizational psychology and organizational behavior really helped me to start to make sense of things. And all of a sudden I took an orthogonal turn and thought, psychology is actually something I'm really, really interested in. That's ultimately what I did a PhD in that area. That sort of left turn, I guess, that I took from a professional and career perspective was absolutely the best thing that I ever did. I had no idea what it would ever lead to, but for me it's actually led to an ability to look at complex systems like healthcare, the people who are in healthcare who are incredibly interesting human beings, and recognize that despite all of the things we say to students about how, check your feelings at the door, and once you put your lab coat on, you're a professional and act like a professional, and professionalism is so important, you cannot divorce a person from the profession. And what we actually need to do is figure out better ways of integrating the personal and the professional. And that's where my interest in competence arose, because if there is anything that tries to separate the two, it is this movement or shift towards competence.
I am emotionally competent. So it sounds in your maze that what really helped you was curiosity. I'm also hearing a willingness to change direction, to allow your curiosity to take you somewhere that wasn't a traditional path. Do you think that there were other visions or experiences that helped guide you during those times of taking an unusual twist or turn?
I'm incredibly grateful for boredom. I hope all of you are listening to the two of us as well. But this notion that by allowing myself to get to a point of boredom and accepting I'm bored of this, and not trying to suppress it or reject it or trying to say, well, if I'm bored of something, maybe I just need to dig deeper into this hole. Actually paying attention to my own boredom and realizing this is a call for me to go in a different direction rather than just going deeper and deeper is something I'm quite grateful for. As I was sort of meandering along these different degrees and trajectories, my father, who actually had a great vision of, after I graduated from pharmacy, I would open up a small pharmacy somewhere. He would come and keep the books for me, and that's what he wanted. At a certain point when I announced, well, this MBA thing was great, but I think I'm going to go back and get some more school, he shook his head and he just said, you know what? Maybe a little bit less learning, a bit more earning would be a good idea. I think he's happy with the way everything eventually turned out, but I think you need to be attuned to what you are actually experiencing.
So we are the Bandar Center for Medical Business Ethics, and that's more our vocabulary. How do you see a relationship between what we've been discussing and the ability, in our system, we have a very complex healthcare industry, which can be confusing and it can be difficult to figure out how to be the best person for our patients. How do you see the things that you think about as connecting to ethics within this space of the business of medicine?
Whether you're in Canada or the United States or anywhere, healthcare is business. It may be run by one, like a government or somebody else, but healthcare is always at its core a business. The most important component of that business is its human resource. Ethics, the ethics of the way a business treats its workforce, the ethics of the way a business nurtures its workforce. All of those are questions that we don't typically think of when it comes to medical ethics. But it's so pivotal to everybody's goal: high quality, safe, effective care. Understanding that the decisions that employers, regulators, bean counters, everybody makes has knock-on effects on the person who is at the bedside, the person working in a lab, the person toiling away in the pharmacy. Everybody is influenced by policies, practices, regulation. And we need to account for them from an ethical perspective, because we're dealing with human beings who are part of the workforce, but also from a practical recognition that when we introduce seemingly innocuous requirements around checklists and competency frameworks and all of those things, they're not innocuous, because all of a sudden they become the dominant way we have of seeing and behaving, and that has effects.
One of my connections to that, being on the state board, we call it the Missouri Board of Registration for the Healing Arts. And when I came onto the board, and this was at the national level with the Federation of State Medical Boards, a hugely emerging conversation has been around physician wellness. Traditionally in the United States, a number of boards would ask very intrusive questions about history of behavioral health issues, history of substance abuse issues, and in 2017 a publication came out showing that I think it was well over 30 boards were asking questions that were out of compliance with our Americans with Disabilities Act. And so I think of that concern if we create this expectation that physicians aren't supposed to take care of themselves, or if they have vulnerabilities, that's somehow a deficit, that can become very dangerous, not only in how people practice, but for our providers themselves.
Yep. It's even interesting, the framing of that comment, that notion that physicians should take care of themselves. Of course they should, but the health system they work in also has responsibilities to help them take care of themselves.
Exactly.
And, I think, historically we have sort of that stoic, independent healthcare professional who, has the internal resources, et cetera, to take care of themselves. But again, that notion that the professional and the personal are somehow divorced, that you can check your personhood at the door as soon as you walk into a clinic. All of those false constructions of what it means to be part of the health workforce are things that we need to challenge. Not only do employers have responsibilities, governments have responsibilities, societies have responsibilities, and if we don't actually collectively view the healthcare workforce as something precious and special that we all need to have an interest in safeguarding, the only option for the healthcare workforce is to shrug and go, tell me what you want me to do, I'll jump through whatever hoop you want me to, but I'm not going to give you anything more than the bare minimum. I'm not going to fire on all pistons. I'm not going to be at my best, because I just can't be.
Thank you. I want to ask if we have any questions at this point from the audience. And I know some people thought about some questions ahead of time.
I'm a physician here in St. Louis. I'm an endocrinologist, and I have been out of training for almost 20 years. And in the U.S., board certification is sort of a measure of competency. And I, in particular, am a very sort of subspecialized endocrinologist. I sort of only focus on one small area. And for board recertification for me, the number of questions on the exam would only be 15% of the entire exam. And so I'm facing recertification to demonstrate my competency. And to hear you talk about sort of, to have to jump through that hoop, it's the time, it's the cost, and just it doesn't help me help my patients to brush up on these areas that I haven't managed for 20 years.
Yep.
And I'm just curious what your thoughts on that in general, because there has been sort of a movement within the U.S., sort of a pushback against some of these requirements, especially for the American Board of Internal Medicine. I think some of the other boards are maybe structure things a little bit more friendly and favorably and sort of give more responsibility to the physician to figure out how they need to demonstrate competency. But
Yep.
I'm just sort of curious about your thoughts on that whole board recertification, how it is in Canada and
Yep.
other countries, and I just would appreciate your insight, because I'm struggling and I don't want to be, up against this hoop that seems unreasonable.
Yep. I think your experience is extraordinarily common and points to the limitations of competence as the framework by which we decide whether people are safe and effective in their field. The time, money, and energy you are spending doing, in essence, a make-work project to figure out how to answer 85% of questions that have no relevance to your day-to-day work is time and energy that could be so better spent elsewhere. And yet, in our attempt to standardize and appear to be quote-unquote fair and procedurally transparent by making everybody jump through this kind of a hoop, we're actually causing more harm, I would suggest, than good. Presumably, you have had a wonderful and successful career. You are not a risk. We actually do have, across many jurisdictions and professions, a pretty good idea of who is at risk of not meeting competence standards. But in any profession that's ever been studied, less than 2% of practitioners ever are actually tracked by their regulatory body as not meeting competency standards. The other 98% who truck along and perfectly fine, they are now saddled with doing exactly what you described, completing requirements that perhaps are appropriate for that 2%, but in the process, what are you being taken away from? What's it done to your professional ethos, your actual interest in your profession? One of the things that's of real interest to me, and partly I think this comes from my background in psychology, is trying to understand the importance of a psychological concept called engagement. Some of you may be aware of some of the, if you travel in airports, you'll see little books about something called flow, the psychology of engagement. And this notion of the psychological fuel we need in order to want to remain competent and to actually be able to remain competent is a real interest of mine right now. The kind of hoop you just described is not only antithetical to engagement and flow, it sucks the life out of you. How could you ever why would anybody want to remain engaged in their profession if their profession is asking them to do certain things like that, that's so blatantly a make-work project? We need to start shifting the channel. We need to start to look at alternative, non-standardized ways of having individuals demonstrate competence. I'm not at all opposed to competence or the demonstration of competence, but the move towards standardization and a one-size-fits-all definition of it that everybody has to prove, despite the fact that all of us are individuals with our own interests, our own career trajectories. Those are the sorts of things that we need to move towards. I am happy to report that in some jurisdictions, and particularly the United Kingdom, with their shift towards right touch regulation, that's exactly the sort of issue they're trying to address. To actually say we need to leave practitioners with more internal resources to focus on engagement, on flow, on their own personal and professional development, and not saddle them with all of these make-work projects. So there are models in other parts of the world that I think could be illustrative for us here.
For me, when I hear your question, I also hear that it costs money to do this. There's an industry around maintenance of certification, and then having gone through different components of maintenance of certification for myself, including an exam, there's also the anxiety part, that I'm somehow at risk of being told at this stage in my career that I could fail.
Yeah. The cognitive and emotional load associated with things like that, not only is it demoralizing, it's wasteful, because you should be spending your cognitive and emotional load thinking about your patients. You should actually be spending your time thinking about your research, thinking about things that add value. But we have a finite amount of time, money, attention, and interest we can dedicate to anything. Competency in all of its manifestation elbows out a lot of other priorities. Every way of seeing something is a way of not seeing other things.
I saw a hand behind.
The whole process of specialization is channeling into narrower and narrower fields, and we see the lack of general practitioners who are able to look at something outside their narrow specialty, and they push people into that specialty rather than look more broadly. And the other thing we see with technology is mashups are actually what's creating new things. And so I question this allowing people to get so subspecialized that they ignore the bigger picture.
That's an excellent point. I think it touches, though, on issues beyond simple regulation or education. A lot of those issues about channeling into these tighter and tighter subspecialties speak to also the incentive, reward, and payment structure. That we don't reward sufficiently generalists. We don't either culturally or financially prioritize generalism sufficiently, and so people understandably vote with their feet. The idea, though, that somehow the kind of competence assessment that we are currently doing perhaps is driving even deeper and deeper specialization, I may have to politely disagree with that. I think it's a very broad issue, but it does start to speak to some of the system issues around who is valued in our system, who gets paid for what they do in our system. Those are other issues that I think go beyond simple competence.
I remember when I was in training, it was said with all seriousness, you have to get yourself a procedure.
Right.
Because if you did a procedure, then that was going to be the way to be in a better pay zone. Other questions at this time?
Well, this is kind of thinking outside the box as somebody who's been retired for 10 years as a surgeon. There's a surgeon, Atul Gawande, who I love to read what he has to say. And I don't know how many years ago, he being an endocrine surgeon out of Boston, was in practice for 10 or 15 years, but he liked to play tennis. And he realized that tennis players at a certain stage in their career would hire a tennis coach. So he hired his mentor, who was then retired, to become his coach. And what he was doing, and to try to upgrade and to reassess his situation, it sounded like a wonderful idea. It certainly didn't take off for him at all, because his contemporaries who were practicing surgery weren't real crazy about this idea or expanding it. I wondered if you had run into anything like that. Yeah, what you're saying is we ought to think outside the box, and I guess that's one way of doing it. It may not be the best way.
Yeah. So I've not heard of that, but I love the underlying thinking, I guess, that story illustrates. While it may sound that I am here to bury competence rather than to praise it, I'm actually not.
Too brute. Sorry.
Competence is a good and decent and noble thing. But unfortunately, one of the problems is that a pendulum seems to have swung so far in one direction, and we seem to be satisfied that competence is all we need to do. That as long as we're measuring it, as long as we're maintaining it, as long as we're making people jump through hoops, then our job is done. We need to keep the best of what competence allows us to do, but perhaps tap on the brake a little bit, free up some time and resources, and get a coach, get a med, do things that actually invest on the personhood side of the equation. Because ultimately, the care and nurturing of a healthcare professional over a 30, 40, 50-year career is an incredibly complicated thing. And by focusing so single-mindedly on competence, and in particular on the technical side of that person-professional duality, we are overlooking so many important things and issues around burnout, occupational stress, disengagement,
Suicide.
suicide. There's so many issues that I think that we're just not able to grapple with because we're spending too much time, money, and energy worried about maintenance of certification exams and recertification exams.
One of the things I found when I was trying to learn how to read your mind, I was looking on YouTube, and I believe you were talking to a society of standardized patients. Do you see ways in which standardized patients can help us begin to do a better job assessing these other components of firing on all pistons?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. I've had the great good fortune for the last 25 years of being connected to an amazing standardized patient group at the University of Toronto. And as you all know, standardized patients are an amazing resource. I really like to think of them as medical educators. They're lay medical educators, but they're just a wonderful, wonderful resource. One of the things that has been, in some ways, some of the most magical work that I have observed has actually been on the remedial end of things. When we have students that actually have difficulties, one of the things that we will do, particularly during OSCEs and other sorts of educational assessments, competency-based assessments, one of the things that we've historically done is find ways of assigning them standardized patients so that they can practice their, interviewing skills, their patient assessment skills, all of those things. Almost by accident, we once actually happened to have a standardized patient who was a retired school counselor, school guidance counselor. And she was a wonderful, warm person who also loved being a standardized patient. And almost accidentally, she just started to talk to this student. And what started out as, an overly direct form of communication, not maintaining eye contact, inability to demonstrate empathy, the things that you don't get check marks for or circles on global assessments for, a whole story started to get unpacked about this student. And using her background as a guidance counselor, an incredible relationship formed between her and this student. And this student had never had an opportunity during their formal degree program to talk about issues of, do I even want to do this for a living? It's my family's really kind of pushing me into this. All of these sorts of issues that we know our students grapple with, but we never talk to them about. What manifested in that circumstance as overly direct communication, inability to maintain appropriate eye contact, lack of empathizing statements, was actually a much deeper issue that needed discussion. None of the faculty had time, interest, inclination, or expertise to do this, but our standardized patient pool is filled with people like this. And when we simply encourage them to actually talk to our learners as though they were human beings, not just widgets that need to be evaluated, magical things happen.
You remind me of a story. I used to be, so now I'm at St. Louis University. I used to be at Washington University. And I had a medical student rotating again through OBGYN because he had failed the first time. And we did have some time in between patients to talk, and what began to emerge was that he was in medical school because of pressure from his parents. And what he really cared about was philosophy of the mind. And he'd written this paper for his psychiatry rotation on a postmodern deconstruction of psychiatry. And he said, could you read it? Because I didn't get any feedback on it. And I read it and I said, well, I'm thinking maybe they didn't understand this because you're coming out of a philosophy tradition. And I finally said to him during this time with him, and it became more and more clear how much, it wasn't even ambivalence, he really just didn't want to be a physician. I finally said to him, has anyone ever told you you do not have to be a doctor? And no one ever had.
Yeah.
And so I believe he finished the MD, and then he went on and followed more of his passion.
Yeah. One of the things, that kind of a conversation happens so rarely anymore. I'm old enough to remember when I first started teaching at a university 35 years ago. We had time, we had interest, and we had encouragement to think of ourselves as professors or researchers or academics as people who actually helped nurture the next generation. And that happens so rarely, it seems now. Things are so much busier, everybody is so much pressed for time. We have accreditation standards that we have to meet. We have to demonstrate psychometric rigor of all of our assessments. We have to be procedurally transparent. We have appeals committees. We create legalistic kinds of antagonisms between faculty and students. And that nurturing socialization role, it just starts to fritter away. And so it sometimes, I think, unfortunately means that for many for many learners in our professions, it's like Lord of the Flies Island. They're kind of raising
I
themselves.
did just reread
Okay.
this, yeah.
Well, they're sort of raising themselves in a certain way. And certainly peer-directed learning, like peers are, of course, incredibly important. But caring, wise, compassionate elders in a profession should also be part of this equation. When we are the hoop that they have to jump through, how can they trust that we can be that wise, caring, compassionate person? It's all well and good for me to say, okay, so right now I have a checklist I need to fill out about you. Okay, I put the checklist. Now, let's just talk. Let's just talk. Why would they trust that they could just talk when 2 minutes ago
Right.
I've been doing this? It's
evaluation.
kind of evaluation.
I will say we are working at SLU. We have a new model. It was originally called Learning Communities. We're now calling them houses. As learning community faculty, one of our roles is to be available in those non-formal evaluation ways to our house students to meet with them, so that we begin meeting someone, knowing them in their first year, and then meeting regularly with them throughout the 4
That's
years.
that longitudinal, and even if there's a way of even going beyond that, like into residencies
Right.
and like all of that, because it is that longitudinal nurturing type of activity that is now so devalued in many contexts, but I think is essential when it comes to personal and professional development.
Another question. I see a hand there.
Current technology has made this assessment of competence even more bleak and candidly rather sad.
I like that, man.
I was first certified in radiology in 1983, and then it was a lifetime certification, and then I voluntarily recertified every 10 years thereafter. 1983, 93, and 2003, they were all oral boards where you sat down next to a human and he or she could judge your competence, your ethics, your judgment. My last certification was in a computer station, and that's the way it's being done now. You empty your pockets. You make sure that cell phone's not there. They wand you when you go in, and if you have to use the bathroom during that 4 to 5 hour exam, you will be monitored by a guard in the bathroom to make sure you're not pulling answers out of some place where it's not
Where
visible.
answers go to hide.
Yes. So I'm just saying I'm not doing it again, I'm retired now, but the last certification was not only difficult, but dehumanizing, candidly.
Well,
And that's the future. That's what these poor guys and ladies coming out now, that's all they'll ever know. They're never going to see this mentor, this professor this esteemed professor talking to you while you're taking your boards. It's very dark.
Yep. And I would argue that part of that darkness, it really is central to an educational, regulatory, and employment regime that has disproportionately valued and emphasized competence as the thing that will safeguard the public. Competence is fine, but I think an engaged practitioner is equally, if not more, important. Engagement is the psychological fuel that allows us to remain competent. And so much of what we do in terms of measuring competence antagonizes engagement. It removes enthusiasm. It diminishes social connection. All of the things that we know inoculate people against competence drift, so many of the things that we do in the assessment of competence actually will impair competence in the longer run, especially if what it ultimately does is get people like you to say, well, why bother anymore? We spend so much time worrying about, should this be pass-fail? Should we be like, maybe honors pass-fail? We could have 3 buckets or this or that, or putting where we're going to put all of our eggs in what baskets. But the problem is we're still talking about the fundamental issue of competency assessment. Any assessment of that sort is always going to be stressful. And for some students, pass-fail will be actually more stressful because it seems so much more arbitrary than a sliding scale. At the end of the day, I don't think it's going to have probably much of a benefit one way or the other. But again, all the time and effort we've spent talking about this particular shift hasn't addressed the underlying issue of what's the competency point, what's the point of this as a model of competency assessment anyway. So, about 10 years ago, I had a PhD student. She was a family physician by original qualification. And if you know anything about Canada, it might be that we came up with CanMeds, which is one of the major competency frameworks that's used internationally. And this student of mine, her name's Cynthia Whitehead, she was a family medicine residency coordinator. She was charged with enforcing CanMeds and competency, and this bugged her to no end. And so she actually her research was to try to figure out who came up with this idea of competency? The idea that and how did it just sort of take over everybody's thinking? How did it hijack medical education, regulation, everything? She did a form of qualitative research some of you may be familiar with. It's called a Foucauldian discourse analysis. That's an extraordinarily long-winded way of describing some work by a French philosopher by the name of Michel Foucault. Foucault, this is a terribly reduced view of something incredibly interesting and complicated, but Foucault was really interested in how certain words assume unquestioned meaning in our lives. So he wrote extensively initially on the concept of madness, and what we would today call insanity. And one of the things that he described was how in the 16th and 17th century, the word madness was understood by the general public to simply mean spiritual possession. People who behaved in ways that today we would recognize as being indicative of psychiatric illness, that kind of madness was thought to be simply spiritual possession. And so if you believe madness is spiritual possession, what's the remedy?
Exorcism.
Yeah, you call a priest. And so you had lots of people that today we would recognize as having psychiatric illness. They would have priests called in and they would do incantations and wave things all over them. In more enlightened times in the 18th century, those exact same observed behaviors were interpreted by their societies not as spiritual possession, but as criminality. And so if you read the work of Charles Dickens, for example, some of the characters in Charles Dickens's work we would recognize as having mental illness, but they would be seen as prisoners. Because if mental illness is seen as a criminal problem, you don't call a priest, you call a police officer. In the early 20th century, we evolved a little bit more. And in the early 20th century, we thought that mental illness was chemical imbalance. If chemical imbalance is what causes these things that we see, you don't call a priest, you don't call a police officer.
You call a pharmacologist.
You call a pharmacologist, you call a chemist. And you make life better through chemistry. Through some of the findings and experiences of the psychiatric survivor movement of the late 20th century, we're starting to recognize that perhaps we need to have a broader understanding of mental illness. Some people see mental illness as simply human variation. Maybe it's simply a gateway to creativity. It's not something to be treated. It's actually something to be understood, accepted, and maybe even nurtured. The point of Foucault's work is that the way you view a word shapes what you do with it. In your lifetime, actually, and certainly in my lifetime, in your lifetime, we have seen an enormous shift in the meaning of words. And the one that Foucault uses, that we can all, is
Queer.
Yeah, homosexuality. When I was your age, what was homosexuality? Today, what do most reasonable people understand or think of homosexuality? The fact that you had like an entirely plausible presidential candidate who was the representative of family values, actually, in the country, who is happily living with his husband. There has been such a seismic shift in what the meaning of that word is for most people. This is where competence, this is, like I told you, a long-winded answer to your question. Where did this idea of competence come from? The first recorded instance of competence being used and applied to healthcare professionals in North America, actually, comes from my part of the world, from the province of Ontario in Canada. So Ontario is the largest province in Canada, so it has a bit of a disproportionate influence on policy and practice in Canada, and eventually that actually tips over into the United States. The first recorded use of the word competence in any kind of regulation occurred in the late 1980s. In the late 1980s in Ontario, there were several high-profile cases of sexual misconduct by physicians. And the regulatory body at that time was thought to have basically very gently slapped the wrist of the offending physicians and not really done anything about it. And this caused an enormous outcry in the press, among politicians, with the general public. The government of the day actually was voted out of office, in part because of the way they handled this, and the new government came in saying, we're going to clean up these wayward physicians. We're going to make sure that they're not just sort of these rogue entities that do anything for themselves. And so what they did was introduce the requirement for mandatory competency-based assessment. The problem they were trying to solve was sexual assault. The solution they came up with was competency-based assessment. It doesn't necessarily make sense unless you take a Foucauldian approach and dig deeper and realize that what competency assessment means to a government, and the only force in society that is bigger than a medical lobby or a medical association is a government, was that what they were actually looking to do was control. That's what competency assessment meant. In the same way that madness may have meant spiritual possession, they use the word competency assessment, but what they're really talking about is reducing autonomy, reducing self-control over your workplace, and increasing the ability of other people to control physicians, which perhaps ultimately would lead to less sexual assault. But they couldn't use that terminology, and instead an entire vocabulary of competence and competence assessment evolved, one that spread rapidly throughout many parts of the English-speaking world.
I didn't know that history. One more question.
I wonder if you could speak to the role that you see interprofessional education playing not only as a mechanism for training and developing some of these affective behaviors you're describing in health professionals, but also in relieving the burden you've described on the individual professional to solve problems on their own and put more of the responsibility on the shared healthcare team and team-based care.
That is an excellent question, and you should be applauded for doing this kind of work, because this is not the future of healthcare, it's the present and actually the recent past of healthcare. But interprofessional education and practice have been incredibly frustrated, and the actual promise of interprofessionalism has been completely, I think, undermined because of competence. Competence is a uniprofessional individual construct. You are competent in your field, I am competent in my field, you are competent in your field. And in that environment where competence is still defined, measured, assessed, and spoken about as an individual attribute rather than as a team or a collective or an organizational attribute, it means interprofessional education is somewhat condemned to be thought of as gravy. But this is exactly what went wrong at that Mid Staffordshire Hospital in the UK. And this is one of the reasons why in the last decade the UK has just raced out ahead of every other jurisdiction in terms of their commitments to interprofessionalism. A hospital where every individual person was competent, yet people kept dying unnecessarily, proves to us, I think, the limits of an individual definition or model of competence. The UK is probably a decade ahead of the United States, about 5 years ahead of Canada, in actually starting to develop a vocabulary and mechanisms for teaching, for understanding, teaching, and assessing competence as an interprofessional team-based construct. And that is absolutely where we need to go to. Removing the individual emphasis, or at least complementing the individual emphasis with that team kind of a focus, is going to be essential to unleash the potential of interprofessionalism.
Thank you for that great last question. And thank you, everyone. I think we now get to move to refreshments.
We should give them a round of applause for their questions. And thank you so much for your great questions. It was really inspiring, actually, to hear such an array of questions and such interest in this.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Zubin. Thank you so much.